Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are joining. We are expecting in this webinar, it will be mostly good morning to you, as we are expecting many participants joining from the Americas and the Caribbean. This is the beginning of a webinar series that the Sanitation and Water for All partnership is convening in collaboration with the Global Water Partnership, UNICEF and WaterAid. And this is the first webinar out of 3 webinars that we will be having over this month of April. Next slide, please, Joel. We have a very interesting agenda for you, and we are very thankful to all the speakers that are together with us right now. We are going to start this presentation with situating this webinar within the series of webinars. I will be doing that. My name is Jose Gesti, and I'm working as climate advisor for the Sanitation and Water for All Secretariat. Then we're very lucky to have with us John Matthews from AGBA, the Chief Executive Officer from AGBA. He's going to talk about the nationally determined contributions and entry points for WASH. We have from the Global Water Partnership Senior Advisor, Anjali Lohani, who will be making a presentation on national adaptation plans. And we are also very, very lucky and very thankful to have government authorities joining us to speak on 3 country case studies. The first one from Nicaragua, we have the Vice Minister Javier Gutierrez with us. We have from Brazil, Karen Silvergrid Cope. And we also have from Mexico, we have Grisel Medina from the Comisión Nacional del Agua in Mexico. We also have lined up, but we're very lucky to have to start discussions. Silvia Gaya, who is Senior Advisor for UNICEF Water and Environment in UNICEF headquarters. And we also have with us Sarah Dicking, who is working as a researcher, fellow research within the Stockholm Environmental Institute. From my side, I just wanted in the next slide to do a quick situation, as I said. We are lining up this series of webinars, 3 webinars, and this is matching these country processes that we want to initiate or to strengthen in countries to get some WASH well integrated into climate policies, and at the same time getting climate integrated into WASH strategies and plans. For that, we have shared with the SWA partnership this guidance, this flow diagram with some guidance. And I just wanted to say that these 3 webinars are linked to these country processes and this country guidance. And we're going to be speaking on different aspects of this flow diagram. Today, the focus of our conversation is on the policy analysis to understand better about the nationally determined contributions, the national adaptation plans, and looking for entry points for WASH into this climate policy. In the webinar 2 next week, we will be looking at existing tools to conduct risk assessments in the WASH sector, and also to identify and appraise WASH climate resilient solutions. Finally, the 3rd week, the 3rd webinar on April 29th, we will be having a webinar dedicated and focused on climate financing. But this is all from my side. Without any further ado, I really welcome John Matthews. The next slide, please, Joao, who will be talking about the nationally determined contributions. And John, we will be happy to pass the slides whenever you let us know. Thanks again, John, and welcome.
Gracias, Jose. Thanks so much. I'm really grateful to be here and speaking to you. It's a much more comfortable hour for me than the talk that I gave a few hours ago. That was 2 in the morning for me. This is I'm going to talk about the indices This is I couldn't find any picture that said NDC in a meaningful way, much less NDCs in water. So I just decided to put a picture of my son running in a fountain. I'm going to talk about this relationship between water and NDCs. Next slide, please.
1 second, sorry to interrupt, John, because I forgot to mention something which is very, very important, and I apologize for that, which is the interpretation. Colleagues, you will see in the lower side of the screen, there is a button that says interpretation. So you can click there and select the type of translation that you need. If you click there, you will see English, Portuguese, and Spanish. So you can please select the channel that is more appropriate for you. Y simplemente por recordar esto mismo en español, decirles que en la parte baja de la pantalla tienen el botón que dice interpretación.
And again, in Spanish, down at the bottom of your screen, to your right, you have the language interpretation option. It is the globe, a globe icon. There you can click and select your preferred language in which you want to follow the presentation. If you want to follow the presentations in Spanish, then you click on the Spanish channel. On the English, then you click the English channel. And then again, I apologize because I forgot to mention this earlier. I hope that everything will run smoothly for now.
The interpretation, because we want to make sure that everybody understands everything that you're going to tell us. Thank you. Thanks again, John.
No problem. So I'm going to start off with the contrast between NDCs and NAPs. There's going to be an excellent speaker right after me who's going to talk about the national adaptation plans. And so the first couple of points I want to make are about the differences really between these. NDCs are pretty new. No one has ever implemented an NDC in history. That really begins later this year. In fact, only about 90 of the 190 signatories of the UNFCCC have actually submitted their final NDC. They are an immature document. At the highest level, if you want to think of a simple label to distinguish the NDCs and the NAPs, you can think of the NAPs as a shopping list, like you take to the grocery store, and you can think of the NDCs as a scorecard that your country says, this is what we're doing, this is our score compared to other countries. And I'm going to be trying to elaborate that a little bit. The NAPs are older. They are, in some cases, there are only about 20, maybe 24 that have been formally submitted. They're mostly with LDCs. There are some middle-income countries that are starting to prepare some NAPs, but really they're lists of projects. They're saying these are the adaptation projects that we need to have funded. And so donors or national agencies or international groups look at that list, and just like a shopping list, they pick things off of it and they say, we want to work on that. NDCs are totally different. NDCs there's a huge amount of variation from one country to another in what they produce. Literally in their length, they can be from 5 or 6 pages long to well over 100 pages in terms of the amount of detail. And the length of it doesn't actually mean if it's a good one or a bad one. NDCs are supposed to talk about issues. They're supposed to say, what is important in our country? How are we contributing to the larger goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement? They are essentially a 5-year plan. To me, it sounds a little bit like the Soviet Union. That they're meant to be revised every 5 years and updated. And within each 5-year period, there's a new term that people are using that they need to be enhanced, so that they get improved during the implementation process, and people try to increase the amount of ambition and level of guidance that's available for it. We have really good guidelines for NAPs. We have essentially no good guidelines for NDCs. And so we're making comparisons between these national scorecards without really a kind of a clear set of rules and guidance. Maybe the most important point to make there is that very few finance institutions are looking at the indices and saying, this is, we want to align with this. There's a new process, it's very new, really a matter of just a few months, that's called the Paris alignment process, where many major donors are starting to look and make sure that their priorities are in keeping with the indices. Next slide, please. If you haven't looked at your own country's NDC, I strongly encourage you to, or countries where you're working. That they are generally, there's at least one component that's a part of every NDC, and it's the mitigation component. It's the part that focuses on carbon. What are the carbon emissions? Are there carbon sequestration goals, energy efficiency, and so on? Those are all really critical. Most countries, but not all of them, also include adaptation. The overwhelming majority of them do, but there are some interesting gaps. There are, for instance, before Donald Trump in the US NDC only focused on mitigation. It had nothing on adaptation. We lost our NDC and we're making a new one right now here in the US that will come out later this month. And I understand that it will include an adaptation component. Grenada here in the Americas also does not have an adaptation component, at least at the last version that I saw in their NDC. There is variation, and also in terms of the amount of detail. This is probably the first place at this high level to think about the connections between WASH and the NDCs. If you look at the little box on the left-hand side, they're actually, we often think first about water and climate adaptation with WASH, but actually there's a strong case to be made for water and climate mitigation with WASH. So thinking about wastewater treatment, fecal sludge management, energy-intensive water treatment, and water supply systems. These are all really good places to look. In the Americas, there have been excellent projects in Bolivia and Peru, for instance, with energy efficiency around water utilities for climate mitigation purposes that are reflected in those countries' NDCs. And that's important and really useful. On the adaptation side, we also have that this is probably the more natural place. Most WASH projects are often at a kind of community scale, sometimes even down to the level of a household. In here, we're thinking about how we do climate proofing, how to address specific types of climate impacts, such as flood and drought risk. Next slide, please. There's a lot of text here, and what I'm hoping is that maybe you can look at this offline. It's meant to really be a kind of like a mini study guide afterwards. So I'm not going to go into all the issues here, but where do we connect the NDCs and WASH? I'd say the first place actually is to find the focal points. The NDC focal points in most countries, I've met them from over 100 countries, are actually, they're normally maybe 80% or 90% of countries are in environment ministries. They don't know very much about WASH. To be able to reach out directly to them, to talk with them about their priorities, about the sequencing, to actually help them understand that WASH is a way to help meet their mitigation and adaptation goals. It's a really easy initial first step. It's also really important, I think, on our side, as people who tend to focus about programs and policies, to be patient. NDCs are still new. As I said, no one has ever implemented one of these, and we're not really sure what it's going to look like over the next few years, how they begin to develop. Next slide, please. One of the strongest reasons to be interested in Indices and Maps is going to be from the perspective of climate finance. And I understand that there's going to be another seminar that's going to focus specifically on this issue. But it is important I think, maybe to introduce the subject here. Climate finance is important for some finance institutions with the NDCs. Maybe the most well-known one is the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund asks explicitly for a link on a project to the NDC to make sure that they that these priorities are really clearly demonstrated. In general, for most types of climate finance, there's also something that's called additionality that's formally tracked and reported. But many groups like the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, they do a lot of their own risk assessment, and they don't necessarily ask you to worry that much about additionality. Next slide, please. What is additionality? It's probably the hardest reach in many cases for WASH organizations in particular, because it represents an abrupt break with the way that we've been thinking about our own work. It literally, in some cases, means making two versions of a project, one in an imaginary world without climate change, and one in a world with climate change, and trying to find the literal difference quantitatively between those two projects is the additionality. And that difference, it could be really big or it could be really small. That's often the part that's the focus of climate finance. Next slide, please. So if you want climate finance, you really need to be able to assess climate risk, and looking very closely at that funder's risk assessment methodology, and that may include this link to the NDC. What I am hearing from many of my colleagues and friends who are in development banks is that they are starting to, they don't like to be aligned to the NDCs now, but that's probably going to change this year or next year. And so, whereas the NAPs are kind of easy because they're already at a project level, they're already that shopping list. There's an extra step in between with NDCs that they go from issues to and priorities to projects, and that alignment process is where we will need to be engaging over the next year. Next slide, please. If you're worried about the NDCs, or you're worried about climate finance, probably the place to focus most is on how to build a climate narrative. That climate narrative should be inside of the NDC. That should be your guidance, because it's essentially a strategy document. Again, it's what that country is trying to tell other countries that we're doing to help organize things. Next slide, please. But there are many other sources of climate finance that don't refer to the NDCs right now. So many national sources may not make reference, or in many middle-income countries, you see the rise of green and climate bonds. These have been important, for instance, in Mexico over the past 2 years. These don't have to relate to the NDCs at all. They don't necessarily have to have any additionality at all. Next slide, please. Where are we headed? I think that NDCs are going to become much more connected to project pipelines. I think as a critical point too, we're going to see a difference between, this is quite new, maybe from about 9 or 10 months ago, a distinction in two types of adaptation projects: climate proofing projects, projects that are traditional development projects, and then they go through a risk assessment process to see if they can continue to operate into the future under future climate conditions, and adaptation projects that their main purpose is actually for adaptation. Most WASH projects are going to be climate proofing projects. It's going to be primarily for water supply and sanitation, and that's not going to change. And we just need to make sure that we're doing some type of assessment that fits in there. And that's going to be critical. And it should be critical in the enhancement process for most NDCs. Next slide, please. A big point that came out in the last session is that the definitions for resilience for the climate change and the WASH communities are different, and they don't overlap in many cases. If you want to make a climate project, it needs to be in the language of climate change. It has to have a strong climate narrative. And that's going to be an essential process, and it probably needs to be linked to the NDCs. WASH is essentially missing. In fact, water is largely missing in a meaningful way in the NDCs right now. And that's something that WASH groups can really support and engage with, and connect other ministries, such as health ministries that are working in WASH, with the environment ministries that house and implement the NDCs. And the last point I want to make is just that actually this process, I think, is useful, and it's probably important. We want to make sure that the sanitation, the wastewater treatment, all of these projects are able to keep performing into the future as the climate continues to change, because we know it's shifting rapidly now, and it's only going to accelerate for the next few decades. So thank you very much. Next slide. I hope you will reach out to me, and I look forward to questions and comments later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. And also, this is the second session that we are doing. As John was alluding, we had a previous one earlier this morning when it was in the middle of the night for you, John. Thank you very much. I think we have started this session very nicely, and John has actually helped us bridge a little bit this topic that we are focusing on today, but also put it in perspective with the broader building the climate narrative, as he has said, the use of risk assessments that we will see later on in next week in the next webinar, and linking up to climate financing. John has made strong remarks about the importance of having WASH well reflected in climate policy, because it's the key to the climate financing later. We're going to continue now with our colleague Anjali Lohani, who is working for the Global Water Partnership as Senior Water Climate Resilience Specialist. And Anjali is going to continue this conversation we have started, now focusing on national adaptation plans. Anjali, thanks again for joining. The floor is yours now.
Thanks very much, Jose, and happy to transition from John and taking this esteemed audience to reflect a little on our national adaptation planning process. Next slide, please. All right, so we've heard from John that countries are prioritizing water for adaptation. And this we do see from their NDCs. The nature of action that they want on water are varied. They include WASH, but they face major investment gaps when it actually comes to implementing the action that they want. If I can take you through some of these figures that are on the slide, you'll see on the left side that, and this refers to the first set of NDCs that countries developed in 2015. So we see that on figure 2, the key climate hazards identified by countries in the adaptation components are related to water primarily. There are floods and droughts, sea level rise, storms, decreased precipitation, and increased variability in precipitation, health-related, water and health-related issues. So countries are experiencing climate impacts via water. In figure 3, you'll see they also want to be undertaking climate adaptation related actions on water. You'll see the priority areas that and sectors that countries list are water, agriculture, health, ecosystems, infrastructure. These sectors related to water. So let's take a shift further down to the right now. What was the country's status when it comes to actually proposed actions on water and NDCs? We see that about 69% of countries have a broad portfolio of actions on water. The nature of this portfolio may vary. They may be a high level list of projects, or there might be some key priority areas, but not necessarily going quite into the project level. Only 10%, in fact, have detailed project proposals. And this, we all know, is key. A detailed project proposal or program of action will be key to secure financing, whether it be from domestic budgets or whether it be from international climate finance sources, as John mentioned. 86% actually of the overall countries requested for international support for implementing their water actions on NDCs. And this international support could be in terms of finance or technology development or capacity building. 74% emphasize, they recognize the need for the national budgets to be contributing to the NDC implementation process. So we see that countries are recognizing that okay, they need to act on water. They rely on international support. They also see that they need to make domestic contributions, but there is a huge gap in actually the investment because only 10% of the countries have actually detailed project proposals. On the bottom right, we're looking at the percentage of countries requesting international finance. That's the total set. So about 2/3 have a water portfolio of projects, but less than 10% here. Quite a small percentage has actual project details. So we see a gap in what the countries say they want to be doing in their NDCs and actual actionable plans to do it. Next slide, please. So here, the national adaptation planning process presents an important avenue to close this water and climate resilience investment gap. What is the national adaptation planning process? It was established, many of you know, by the 2010 Cancun Adaptation Framework, and it enables countries to formulate and implement national adaptation plans as a means of identifying medium and long-term adaptation needs and strategies and programs to address those needs. It's a continuous and iterative process that countries undergo. There's a national adaptation plan that they develop, but actually implementing that plan, revisiting that plan, strengthening that plan, it's a continuous process. But there's insufficient progress if you look at the status of what has been achieved since 2010 to now. There was a global goal for all countries to have a NAP by 2020 end. What is the status? Out of 154 developing countries, 125 have initiated the process to formulate a NAP, 21 have submitted a NAP, but only 4 of them, and they're highlighted on the table there, Burkina Faso, Sudan, Togo, and Ethiopia. Only 4 of them are the least developed countries, which which have the least adaptive capacities and therefore most vulnerable to climate change. So much to be done, but there's an opportunity for the WASH community here, primarily in this audience, as we're thinking of linking WASH, engaging WASH in climate resilience planning, there's a huge opportunity. Next slide, please. So how do countries undertake national adaptation plans? There is some guidance provided by the UNFCCC Secretariat, particularly the least developed countries expert group, we call the LEG, have developed this guidance document in 2012. You'll find it on NAP Central. If you Google NAP Central, you will see this resource there. These technical guidelines outlines the NAP process that can be undertaken in 17 steps. Can be seen as linear, in element A following, element B following element A, thereafter C and D. But again, there's a recognition that this process is feeding. It's a circle, it's feeding one element into another, and it's a continuous and iterative process. But it also recognizes that countries are at different levels of adaptation planning. Some are quite advanced in the, on the NAPA, which was the National Adaptation Programs for Action, which preceded the NAP process. So these were, as John said, a shopping list of activities, primarily at subnational level, as well as some at the national level, but they were not comprehensive strategies at the national level, but they were fundable projects. So some countries might have initiated that. Some countries might have undertaken a comprehensive national adaptation planning process. Others might be further behind. So this 4-element process of laying the groundwork, taking stock, creating the national mandate to undertake a cross-sectoral NAP process, and B, getting the technical elements in place, like doing the vulnerability analysis, identifying what climate hazards risks need to be addressed, then appraising the different options to address these risks, implementing those risks, and then reporting, monitoring, and actually further informing future action is outlined in this guidance prepared by the UNFCCC. Next slide, please. So as for the topic of this webinar, what does this guidance mean for the WASH community? This is just a quick shot, perhaps a simplified shot at what potential entry points there might be for the WASH community in this NAP process, as per the 4 elements described above. We see there's a strong need for the WASH community to be engaging in under element A, which is laying the groundwork and initiating the NAP process. For the WASH community to be engaged in the political conversations of where the NAP process is being initiated and prioritized, to be providing the baseline info that is available to the WASH community. How are the WASH systems in the country experiencing climate hazards, and what opportunities are there to respond to them? What are the capacity needs and gaps that need to be addressed? Then element B, we will go through this in further detail. It's an actually, assessing climate vulnerabilities, identifying and appraising adaptation options, and then integrating these climate change adaptation actions into sectoral planning. So there is a strong role for the WASH community to be playing there, as well as an element C, which is implementation, element D for monitoring and review. Next, please. And then I just wanted to share with you some technical guidance notes that are available for element B, which is stemming out of a partnership of UNICEF and the Global Water Partnership. But these technical guidelines are available to the global community to be utilizing and integrating WASH into national adaptation planning. In particular, these guidance notes provide some resources on climate risk assessments for WASH, linking risks with response, and then appraising and prioritizing potential adaptation solutions, as well as integrating WASH in general and climate resilience into national WASH strategies and adaptation plans. Next slide, please. Then there is also further guidance, technical guidance, and importantly also identifying the political, the entry points in the political processes that undertake that involve the national adaptation planning process in countries. And this is kind of summarized in what we call the NAP Water Supplement. It's a technical supplement focusing on different water subsectors, and this is a complement to the UNFCCC's cross-sectoral general national adaptation planning guidelines that I introduced before. And this document is prepared by the Global Water Partnerships in conjunction with the UNFCCC, but also importantly engaging with different partners and governments, the partners on different water subsectors. This guidance note, I'll go into it in just a little bit detail. It's not prescriptive. Countries will need to scope out what they have, the baseline that they have, and what needs to be done, and create streams for their own work at national and subnational levels. There's plenty of examples there that can provide some inspiration, some ideas on how to tackle certain issues. Also some key technical references. And then importantly, this document stresses on the need to build on existing activities and to enter the NAP process at appropriate points, whatever is available at the country level, and to sequence activities in the most effective way. Next slide, please. Okay. The document also, goes through some of the decision-making processes that take place at different levels within the country, at the highest cabinet or the parliament level, national climate coordination level. There could be technical committees, cross-sectoral, and then further below, line ministries, and then comes the public, civil society, private sector. The NAP process is, a generic NAP process is outlined here, along with different decision points at different levels. And it's important for the WASH community and the water community in particular, who is not often engaged in the climate processes in the country, to be aware of these processes so that they can identify what entry points they can make in their countries. Here, some potential opportunities are highlighted in the gray boxes. I invite you to look at the supplement. But this can provide an introduction of where potential entry points may be. Next slide, please. Then the water supplement also touches upon the financing for water in the NAPs, both touching upon financing needed for development of the NAPs per those 4 elements that I described above. John has already said that GCF readiness funding can be available to countries for this for NAP planning, up to 3 million per country. And then for the implementation of the NAPs, is actual development of projects, and even undertaking of those projects from the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest, on the right side, you'll see on the bar chart, the largest contributor when it comes to water and climate resilience. They support the development of concept notes development of concept notes and building of institutional and technical capabilities in the country needed to implement national adaptation priorities. Next slide. Okay, key messages. I won't go through them, to highlight the key factors here are embedded in-country capacity and ownership, using an economic case, emphasizing the opportunity cost of not undertaking adaptation, and making sure that speaks to the national development processes. For example, taking a risk-based approach, learning by doing, ensuring stakeholder ownership, also transboundary dimensions, important especially on the water supply side, as well as water quality side as well, included in this. And then importantly, the need to balance political, technical, and financial feasibility when it comes to water, WASH, and the national adaptation planning process. And with that, I will leave you with some links to the NAP Water Supplement in the next slide, in English, Spanish, and French. The Global Water Partnership is currently supporting the government of Zambia in developing a national adaptation plan using this supplement, and funds have been accessed from the GCF Readiness Program for this. So it's the first phase is a cross-sectoral NAP, and then the second phase is a development of a water-centric NAP, which will be addressing WASH issues as well. So I leave you with that, Jose.
Thank you so much, Anjali. That was a very comprehensive presentation, and it has helped us, understand a little bit that there is certainly, that there is the process is been going on, but there are many countries still formulating their NAPs. So probably, through this presentation and your guidance, colleagues have seen that there is technical guidelines available, and there are sector tools that can help with the entry points that you have highlighted for the WASH sector, and how to make sure that the WASH sector is part of the formulation of these national adaptation plans. And together with, I think it's a very complementary presentation with what John has explained. We have now built a much better idea of NDCs and NAPs. And with this, I think we are ready now to transition. Thanks again, Anjali. We are ready to transition now into a set of 3 country case studies. We are going to see now how at the country level, the things that John and Anjali have explained are crystallizing, and we're going to feel a little bit, the temperature of what is going on in Nicaragua and Brazil and Mexico. So for the first, next slide, please, Joao. For the first case study, we are really lucky to have Javier Gutierrez, who is the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources. The Vice Minister will then share the slides. We're going to allow...
Buenas, saludos.
Muy buenas.
Saludos a todos, a todas.
Greetings. Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm here with Carlos Juarez, the specialist in water resources. who will deliver the second part of this presentation, and we are going to stick to the 7 minutes we have. When we speak about climate change, we have to put certain things on the table because those things are very important for countries such as Nicaragua. Nicaragua is actually one of the most vulnerable states when it comes to climate change. We have some general figures on the country in the next slide. In this slide, we have about 3.4 million hectares, which is 34% of the national territory. 49% of those forests are in the hands of indigenous peoples' territories. We have 6 main water basins, and the water offer is 300,000 million cubic meters, and that is 15,000 cubic meters per person per year. We have estimated that the vulnerable population is of 1.1 people, and that's mainly people living in rural areas and in indigenous peoples. And we have
Como pueden ver, tenemos cuatro.
As you can see, we have 4 major environmental stressors, 4 situations that affect us when it comes to territorial planning. This is the hurricanes. Recently, we had 2 hurricanes in a couple of weeks' time between them, and they caused a great deal of damage in infrastructure and material resources. We also have droughts. This is very serious for our countries. We have other situations and elements such as floodings. Climate change, well, Nicaragua is around 0.3% worldwide when it comes to emissions. Our emissions are therefore not very significant or relevant. However, in terms of vulnerability, we are one of the 10 most vulnerable countries. According to GEMWASH reports, we are number 3. This is based on adaptation, and this is why our plans are based on adaptation too. We do not want to turn our back to the global context of climate change, where the picture is very clear, but it is very complex at the same time. It is clear that we are currently bordering emissions that are very dangerous, over 400 particles per million. This is the figure that we see in some countries, and we have to take into account the relevant capacities. Those countries should make the greatest efforts in order to reduce and improve the adaptation efforts. We will need to make the most effort, and this calls for the most cost also. So this is paramount for our countries. And indeed, our position is very much consistent with that of our president, Comandante Daniel Ortega, as he mentioned at the 70th session of the UN General Assembly in September 2015, when he's talked about how we don't see much progress being made in terms of climate justice and common responsibilities. This, in terms of protocol, I would like to mention this, and now give the floor to Jose Maria Juarez. He is the person in charge of climate change. Good morning. In reply to the questions that were provided to us, whether we ended our adaptation national process, well, we are in the preparation stage. We have several assessments on climate change, and this is on agropecuary, forestry, water resources, human health, infrastructure, and biodiversity. Well, what are the times that we are managing for the completion and submission of the national plans? We are now working on the indicators and the vulnerability measures and assessments. In reply to the question of who is managing these processes, is Marena. Marena coordinates and manages the national climate change response climate through a policy to tackle climate change. They work alongside 23 public administrations and institutions. Do we invite the water and sanitation sector to the debate? Well, indeed. As part of the national response system, there are two key questions, which is the national water and sewage management system and the Water and Sanitation Commission, and their contributions are taken into account and aligned to the different lines of actions we have. Is our country part of the Paris Agreement? Indeed, Nicaragua signed the Paris Agreement under the principle of co-responsibility in November 2018, and we submitted our first NDC in November that year. With regard to the process, to the NDC processes, we submitted our last version of the NDC in December 2020 with the new opportunities for mitigation and adaptation, and this comes basically through the sewage and water management sector, which is directly linked to sewage water management and drinking water management to make these systems more resilient to climate change. Is our country part of the Paris Agreement? Well, I already said that it is. How do we reflect the needs to adaptation to the wash services in the NAPs? Well, through the human's health, water resources, the needs to improve the infrastructure and the national use of resources. Do we invite the wash sector to debate? Well, indeed, because these institutions participate with the climate change group. Whether the NAP was submitted successfully and whether it included wash elements, well, through different technical sessions, work group meetings, through different studies conducted, we established the different strategic lines. How do we finance wash elements? Through the state's budget and also bilateral and multilateral coordination programs and partnerships. Whether it is clear for WASH on how to include our priorities of adaptation and opportunities of mitigation through the promotion of actions to increase the availability of water according to the demand for human consumption, for production, for energy, and for industrial services. And let me highlight that the NAP not only seeks a greater availability of water and sanitation for human consumption, but for all these sectors. How do we reflect drinking water and wash in our systems? Well, through the development of infrastructures of drinking water and sanitation programs for the resilience of water systems for urban services. Thank you. Thank you very much. Vice Minister Javier Gutierrez, and the last presentation by Carlos. Thank you very much indeed. We could see how indeed the wash sector can be incorporated to the adaptation plans and how we can make reference in the nationally the indices, the national contributions. Thank you for this overview that explained how Nicaragua is working towards that integration in a successful manner.
Will give the floor to the second case study to Brazil, and we open the floor for Karen Silvergood Cope, who is General Coordinator of the Oceans, Antarctica and Geoscience, joining from the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation in Brazil. Previous to that, Karen played a key role in actually the formulation of Brazil National Adaptation Plan that was submitted in 2016. The floor is yours, Karen, and thank you so much for your intervention.
Thank you, José. Good morning, good afternoon.
Muito obrigado, José. Eu vou continuar em português. Eu não tenho uma apresentação. I don't.
Como José apresentou, eu não estou.
As José has just mentioned, I'm not in the NAP anymore, but I was responsible for it. And from 2012 to 2016. So when I'm like to share it and focusing on water resources management, the process started in 2012 when the Ministry Committee asked Brazil to create this National Adaptation Plan, and the Environment Ministry was in charge of coordinating the task force to produce the NAP that was focused on 11 sectors, including water resources. The task to work in a multidisciplinary level demands huge coordination effort and huge alignment in the country, not only amongst ministries, but also when it comes to establishing dialogues amongst different departments that should be well defined. So we define this network, this topic networks for the development of each subject. And it took us around 2 years for the 11 topics. We created different groups of leaders with a wide community of people participation. So for instance, we had the water network, and it was cleared by the National Water Agency, which is the agency that regulates waters in Brazil, and also the Environment Ministry. And every ministry involved had a representative on that group. Besides, there were participants of the industry, representatives of the industry, of companies that have as input intensive water processes, and also civil society representative, which have their own agenda. So the group got together for during these 2 years in a monthly basis. The meetings took place every month, and so that was before the pandemic. So we were not that used to be working virtually. So we were used to doing in-person meetings, and that, of course, there are some limitations involved because of that, because they were not virtual meetings. But we were able to keep up the debate between federal government and state governments. And this multiple connection that happened in an active and interactive way. It was affecting different layers, and there was huge input compilation because of that. And by doing that, we consolidated the strategic document. And why is that so important? And which experience would I recommend to any country or to government agencies that are leaders in adaptation strategies? Every actor of the process should be engaged, every stakeholder, and you cannot rush into the end of the process, even though it seems like a bit chaotic. And now we can organize it much better because the virtual world has helped us to do that. But the fact that we had state representatives and civil society representatives, it helped us a lot to define challenges and different visions when it came to creating the strategy. And that is why the public consultation is more legitimate afterwards. It was, I should say, it was a very positive project, and it came through with the National Adaptation Plan formulation. This feeling of ownership of that each participant has written part of the document, that was key to us. So we had ideas previously, we had our expectations and different conceptions that changed throughout the process, and that document that was the result of that guided a more productive dialogue amongst the networks, and it was also the support for the international discussion. And nowadays we have different virtual tools of debate, and so that's why I think it's mandatory to outreach to as many players as possible, and that has to come together with some creativity and conflict resolution, but it should go before the public strategy, so that this public strategy is really consistent and perennial in a way. And we did that with national resources from the National Fund for Climate Change. And we were able to hire different support consultancies for systematizing documents. You can imagine how huge it was, the compilation of data. But also, we could use the Space Research Institute, the EINPI, because they provided us very important data on climate change impact in Brazil. That has to do with the technical aspects of the process, the engaging part. And I'd like to mention something else, which is really important, that has to do with the technical aspects. Adaptation might be planned in using different methodologies. You can consult with the stakeholders, you can do the perception. But in Brazil used the methodology that started from climate modeling and then scaled into for Brazil's regions. And that's why I mentioned the INPE, the INPI in Brazil, because they created this impact on short or on water shortage for Brazil in the years to come. So using that technical based, we discussed impact challenges, water resources, and which solutions would be needed to avoid or mitigate those impacts. So using this technical framework, we implemented the debated, and that has helped us reach the concrete results that we were looking for when it came to water resources. And that was what I wanted to bring to you here today. I hope it was clear. And if you need any additional clarification, just ask me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you. We really, really appreciate your inputs, your perspective from an app manager who has been able to put in place such consultation processes. What we can say from our side is when looking at the 21 NAPs already available, we really see how well the water, sanitation and hygiene sector is reflected in the Brazil NAP. We consider your NAP, the Brazil NAP 2016, an example if somebody wants to look on how it could be, to have a good NAP that reflects well on drinking water, sanitation and hygiene. The activities that have been included within the broader water resources and the health sectoral approaches in your NAP are a good reference for other countries. So we thank you for your explanations as well. You were able to provide us a little bit with the timeline on how long does it take, and the effort needed to be able to have such consultation processes in place. We congratulate you and we thank you, Karen, for your inputs. And without further ado, we will then ask our colleagues in Mexico. Giselle Medina is working for the National Commission, the Water National Commission in Mexico, and she has a few slides to share with us before we jump into a discussion. Thank you so much, Giselle.
Al contrario, muchísimas gracias a todos los organizadores y organizadoras de este evento.
Thanks very much to all the organizers of this event. I'm here with Michel Cobian from International Corporation and Juan Jose from Water Planning. And I can see that Natalie Celine is also there. So the idea now is to tell you about the case of Mexico regarding the NDC and its link to SDG 6. I will not go through every detail. I will just underline that in Mexico, we have a national system against climate change, and its target is that everyone working on it discuss or are related. We, CONAGUA, are a body participating here. There is the general law on climate change, and here you have the link in case you want to read the details. And we have the Under-Secretary Commission of on climate change, and there are also working groups, as you can read here. Next slide. According to what's stated in the Paris Agreement, the Mexican government backs the commitments or the engagement taken in to not to make a temperature rise beyond 2 degrees. The update I want to give you is the mitigation component, and John Matthew already underlined or mentioned the differences between both, and there you'll be able to see our commitment, which is reducing the greenhouse emissions by 22% and also reduction of black carbon by 2030. And as determined condition commitments is reducing greenhouse emissions. Regarding the adaptation component, what we are now trying to reflect is more vulnerability in our country. We, just like my colleague from Nicaragua, are placed in a very fragile place because we have hurricanes, we have earthquakes, and we have many surprises all year round. And also, you will find an annex with information on the transparency framework. Next slide, please. what we want to say here is that on top of the whole natural system on climate change, we have representatives of the academia, scholars, civil society, and society in general, and the government has given the mandate to be the link between the population and the institutions. And this has been very important because it is shown in our regulatory documents. In our planning, we said that all the tools of the current administration had to be aligned with the SDGs. And therefore, we are very related to that. And that was very good when it came to planning. And it is also linked to other international conventions. In this administration, we were asked to focus on the eradication of poverty. Next slide. In all these updates, we have the adaptation component, mitigation component, and in the adaptation component axis or column, we see 4 lines of action related to the integrated adaptation of water resources and other things. And as you can see here on this chart in blue, where we refer to adaptation, you can see all 4 lines of action, and they are aligned with mitigation. And it is also stated the relevant SDGs. The first one is actions on the sustainable use of water resources. Second one is to promote environmental and water resources through conservation, protection, and restoration of the basins. Number 3, to increasing the treatment of waste water from industry and cities, ensuring good water quality for human settlements. And finally, ensuring access to water for human consumption. To the right, in that chart, this one is related to mitigation. And we work on waste. As you can imagine, we consider wastewater from cities and the industry, and also the activities to leverage biogas. Next slide, please. Here, when it comes to integrated management of water resources, we can see the following topics related to WASH. Sustainability of extraction and provision of drinking water in terms of scarcity, creating a building capacity. Third, fostering research and technology development, and finally the efficient use of water resources. So this is how we have portrayed updates on the NDCs. To conclude, I will say that this process was very interesting for us because, as it was said during the discussion, in spite of being a part of the environmental sector, we don't always speak the same language because of the specificities of each group. So we need to reinforce interinstitutional coordination. Then on the other hand, water governance is very complicated because there are federal, state and local levels, and the only way to move forward is to coordinate. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. Just Grisel, you had a wonderful closing for this series of country presentation. That call for governance was great. And also the fact that very often we work on the same issue, on the same resource, but we use completely different languages, and there are specificities when it comes to drinking water and water for human consumption and so on and so forth. And so we sometimes speak a different language. So that call for coordination and for governance was excellent. It was very interesting to see that in Mexico you are working with this SDGs that also embrace climate change with adaptation and mitigation. And then there's also water, sanitation, and hygiene, WASH. Thank you very much. I think it will be very useful for those countries working right now on their NDCs or updates and their NAPs. Thank you very much, Grisel, and thanks to all three countries that gave us their approach. It was very interesting to see about the different climate policies and the adaptations. We have now
we have first Silvia Gaya joining from UNICEF headquarters. She's a senior advisor. Joao, maybe you can bring the presentation so that everybody can see Silvia's title. Silvia, in the meantime, really great, and we are very lucky to have you. Thank you very much for joining, and we are looking forward to see how, from your perspective, UNICEF is moving, with this integration of climate resilience and trying to influence nationally determined contributions and maps. If we will be very thankful to hear from you.
Thank you, Jose. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thanks a lot to SWA for this initiative. It's very important, and UNICEF is super glad to co-convene this series of global webinars around this subject. Indeed, UNICEF is making a strong effort to advance the climate resilient WASH agenda because, as you may know, we have programs in more than 100 countries, and all our teams have been really briefed on the importance of influencing the NDCs and the NAP processes, because for us it's a very critical starting point. Our overall view, however, is that WASH is very poorly reflected in the NDCs and not adequately reflected in the NAPs, or at least this is what we see on the documents that have been shared so far with the UNFCCC. This is a big concern for us because from one hand, we see that the development funding is really shifting towards green funding more and more increasingly and quite quickly. And on the other hand, we see that in order to benefit from this green funding, we need to really demonstrate how climate resilient WASH is a national priority. It has to be recognized as a national priority. And therefore, it's very important for us to assure that climate resilient WASH is included in the NDCs and in the NAPs as a key priority for the different, for each of the countries, right? So we are, of course, happy to see that there are good examples. As we have seen today, some of the countries have explained what they are doing, and we see a very good progress. And they have somehow managed to reflect much better these adaptation needs for the WASH sector in the NAPs and in the NDCs, as we have heard. In the case of NDCs, our experience is that in some countries, climate policy is quite a sensitive topic, and UNICEF involvement sometimes requires a high-level advocacy efforts. When we have shown interest with some governments to provide inputs to NDCs in some, not all, but in some countries, we have only been able to access the final draft of this NDC document through the involvement of our UNICEF representative, which is the highest authority on behalf of UNICEF in that country. Another entry point that I wanted to comment and to reflect upon is that In order, I mean, we have been able to provide inputs to the update of the NDCs, and we have been able to do this through developing a very good relationship with the national designated authorities, the NDAs. For example, through commissioning studies that are led by UNICEF on the impacts of climate change on the water sector, or on children, or on the communities, and therefore this is also another good entry point. In relation with the NAPs, UNICEF has been invited in some countries to national stakeholder discussions, but we consider that this is not really happening in a very consistent way. The interface of inadequate access to drinking water and sanitation, coupled with the impacts of climate change, seriously threatens sustainable development and the community resilience overall. And therefore, we really need to see that the adaptation needs of the water sector adequately are reflected, in the formulation of the NAPs. As this has been explained also today, we have seen that there are very good sector tools that are in place that are great entry points to support NAP formulation in countries with well-established methodologies that we are using in many countries. And I think that there is another webinar where we are going to present and discuss a little bit more in depth about that. And this is in order to appraise and prioritize climate resilient water solutions, not only to look at the aspect of the infrastructure that needs to be climate proof, but also how this is going to help the communities to become more resilient. We also see that there are countries that are developing thematic NAPs, and for instance, the health NAPs led by WHO. And we would like to really see this picking up into the WASH sector, taking similar initiatives in countries. And really, we also applaud the initiative of the GWP in Zambia, as we have heard, because they are the first water organization providing core support to the government in Zambia to develop their NAPs with the intention of developing a water NAP for the country. So this is really some very good example too. As I have mentioned before, the key to climate finance is really locked for WASH if we cannot demonstrate how WASH is reflected in these NDCs and in these NAPs. So we have, unfortunately, clear examples of that things have been locked because of not being the WASH sector recognized as a priority. And that's why we are really supporting the development of concept nodes for the Green Climate Fund, for instance, at country levels, while in parallel, we are working with governments to really reflect their adaptation needs for the water sector, of course, and the submission of their updated NDCs so that the concept node will be reinforced and is not totally rejected by, for instance, in this case, the GCF board. So I hope that between all of us and all of you, we will be able to make this important move to assure a fully equipped, let's say, climate resilient water sector, and also make it feature as one of the key sectors that are the solution to the climate crisis. So our sector has to be first a priority, but also the solution. So now handing over Jose again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Silvia. That was really, really interesting to hear from an organization such as UNICEF working so closely with water, sanitation, and hygiene. I could highlight some of the things that you mentioned in terms of the sensitivity, right? That it seems that when trying to influence this process, there is sometimes a little bit some sensitivities, and then you really have to go with your, with your higher level officials to try to be able to influence that, and also the call that you're making to try to wake up the sector also to have national adaptation plans, thematic ones, right? That then they can be part of the national adaptation planning processes. Thank you very much, Silvia. That was really, really useful. And then I will then ask our final discussant. Her name is Sarah Tinkin. She's joining us from the Stockholm Environmental Institute, together with CV, Stockholm International Water Institute. She was leading our research on what we are discussing today, which is exactly the linkages between NDGs and SDG 6, in this case, with an emphasis on sanitation as well. So, you know, sometimes sanitation is the forgotten part of the WAS. The S is the forgotten piece of the WAS acronym, and in some cases, yeah, I mean, John has started this presentation by, you know, opening our eyes on the opportunities for mitigation of the WAS sector, precisely from sanitation, in addition to, of course, the adaptation needs. So looking forward to having your insights, Sarah.
Great. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm going to be talking about gaps related to sanitation, like you mentioned, and this has been a little bit overlooked compared to water. And I'm going to talk about 3 gaps that we have found relating to the nationally determined contributions and climate action more broadly. So we've heard a lot about how there are gaps in mitigation and adaptation in the WASH sector and how we're addressing those. I'm going to talk about things from the policy level, more from the global policy perspective, and using the example of the NDCs, which give us a really good example of what countries are doing and what they're prioritizing. So we've already heard a bit about those, but there are voluntary commitments that countries are making, mostly relating to emissions reductions, but they also include other activities like adaptation. I want to share some of the research we've been doing looking at the NDCs using SEI's NDC SDG connections tool, which breaks the NDCs down actually into a series of concrete activities. So not just references, but something more concrete. And we looked at how those linked up to SDG 6. And we actually found that about 10% of these activities linked to SDG 6. But then when we look at that group, we found only 2% were related to sanitation and 3% related to wastewater. So we see really very few activities in the NDCs on sanitation, and this is an important gap. And of these, we actually found that most of them were adaptation as opposed to mitigation, despite the fact that the sanitation and wastewater sector makes quite a large indirect as well as direct contribution to emissions in the sector. And actually, it was interesting to hear about Mexico's example where they are looking at the waste issues. And I think this is actually quite rare and maybe a good example for other countries. And we did look at the geographical breakdown of these findings. So most of them, most of these activities relating to sanitation were actually reported by lower middle income countries. There were no activities included by high income countries. And this is quite important because many of those countries are contributing large emissions from the wastewater sector. We saw the most activities from the MENA region as well as sub-Saharan Africa. This could be due to water scarcity issues as well as experience in that region with wastewater reuse, for example. But overall, we see that sanitation is really not included in the NDCs. And we don't know if this is because there's some kind of gap in terms of understanding the linkages between sanitation and climate change. We think this is probably the case, so there needs to be more awareness about these linkages. And to look more at these gaps, we looked at climate finance as well, and we found, we looked at proposals that were approved by the GCF, so as a specific data source. And we found there that there was really only a handful of projects that had sanitation components. And of those that had those sanitation components, they actually got very, very little funding compared to the overall GCF budget. I think it was like $1 million US compared to $1 billion in budget. So, and actually these were often co-financed. So it was actually governments maybe paying for the sanitation component. So we can see again that there's a lack of understanding or awareness or perhaps evidence at the country level of these linkages. And that may be why we don't see any climate finance proposals. It also could be that climate finance organizations are also not aware of these linkages and they're not adequately supporting proposals. And we know it, of course, proposals can be quite resource intensive to prepare. The last point I wanted to make just briefly is a gap in terms of how we're viewing some of these issues relating to vulnerability. So we've heard about the concept of additionality. And from my perspective, we need to think a little bit more holistically about things. So we often think about climate proofing particular infrastructure and technology, but we're forgetting that lack of access to water and to sanitation as essential services actually increases vulnerability to climate change. So we need to think about that from a much broader perspective. So I think in the interest of time, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I think that the way that your intervention wraps up everything that we've been discussing over the last hour is really interesting, because in a very methodological way, you have really brought everything that we have discussed together. You have talked about, you have kind of demonstrated through the research how the lack of sanitation at the climate policy level obviously translates, as you have seen, in the lack of climate financing for sanitation, the lack of proposals, and then I think your hypothesis is very true, right? I mean, what can be the reasons for this to happen is that either the linkages between sanitation and climate change have not been understood or have not been expressed properly, and therefore there is not a clear understanding on those connections, you know. So I think this is something to take forward. You know, we have the WASP community listening to us, and these are some of the things that we need to address all together if we want to see, you know, next time that you do this check, you know, that hopefully we see that sanitation is more prominently featuring into the NDCs, and therefore unlocks the key for climate financing. Thanks again, Sarah. Thank you very much. I think it was really interesting, the insights that you brought to this discussion. And then we have had over the last hour, almost and a half, an active chat box with interesting comments. Actually, a couple of them point out, again, you know, financing and the issues of who is going to finance these national priorities that we are aiming at having. John started the presentation by sharing some of the bottlenecks for NDC implementation. It was in his early slides when he was already pointing at the lack of financing as one of the key bottlenecks, but he also has some points about the sectoral coordination and you know, how the climate community is realizing that the sectors need to be brought in. It's not just a climate discussion that happens in a silo. It has to be bridged with sectoral discussions. From our country colleagues and the experiences that have been shared, we've seen that it's possible. We've seen that actually the national adaptation plans are able to capture the adaptation priorities in different sectors. Indeed, we have seen how GWP is going to take this to the next level, developing in Zambia, particularly an adaptation, national adaptation plan dedicated to water. UNICEF has called for this to be elevated. UNICEF has shared how countries are developing health adaptation plans, so why not to more strongly start working with these adaptation components. We have just 3 minutes left, but perhaps, I don't know if, Grisel, if I could put you on the spotlight, as you were making some mentioning on the mechanisms that Mexico is using for financing. I don't know if it could be okay, Grisel, if you would like to have just 1 or 2 minutes to reflect a little bit on how you are seeing this from Mexico, you know, the mechanisms that you see in place. If that's okay with you, you can open your microphone and come in. But otherwise, or if we have colleagues in Nicaragua or Brazil that would like to talk about how from the country, from a country point of view, you know, what are the mechanisms that you see that you could like to put in place. As a reminder, we have said that we will have webinar 3 that is actually going to try to expand this discussion of the climate financing. It will be on April 29th, and we will have a full webinar seminar session dedicated to climate financing. But in the meantime, if there is any other question, It's also good to see in the chat box how we've seen the colleagues from Honduras are open to have support from specialists participating in this webinar to be able to use the tools that have been shared. Also, we are really happy to see how the intervention from Karen in Brazil has, shown. We have participants showing interest in the Brazil NAP and also the consultation processes that Karen has described. So we are happy to see this cross-fertilization. That was obviously the intention of this is the intention of these gatherings and webinars, to try to cross-fertilize a little bit and showcasing some initiatives to try to take this forward. If I will try to take a final look to the last messages. If there are no further questions, we are going to be right on time now. It's going to be exactly right now, 90 minutes since we started. So if there are no questions that you could like to address, the only thing is to looking forward to having you next week on Tuesday again for webinar 2 that will talk about other tools for risk assessments for WAS and different WAS climate resilience options. That will be next week. And then on the 29th, we have the webinar 3 on climate financing. So looking forward to having you all. You will be able to find the recording of this presentation both in English and Spanish on the Sanitation and Water for All Partnership website. Thank you all the speakers. Thank you so much. And thank you all of you for participating and being actively contributing to the chat box and the discussion. We hope that you found this session useful. Thanks again.
For everything. Okay, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your invitation. Very glad, very important. Thank you for so much.
Very much welcome, Julia. Thank you so much. We will close the session right now. You will have it available on our website. Thank you so much.